Hey, Peter.
Oh, yeah. Hey, David, how are you today?
I'm good. Welcome back to All In on Data.
Yeah, welcome back to I forget how many, what number this is so far. And like, I think we mentioned on the previous one, we actually have a real name. Call me
All In on
Data.
Data. No, yeah, call me Data. Sorry, I messed it up already. Clearly, my second cup of coffee hasn't had an effect yet. Um, yeah, so we're
Well,
calling the podcast All In on Data, and
no,
it's
call me
sorry, we're
Data.
calling the podcast Call Me Data. I'm very confused today because we were
Uh,
talking earlier about the fact that we also wanted to take a moment to explain the origin of the name All In on Data for our company. So we'll get to that in a second. But our topic today is data strategy, and it is something near and dear to our heart. It's actually sort of the core of why we created the company we created, and we want to do this as a two-part podcast because we have a lot to say about data strategy. So I think we're going to start the conversation today, and we'll finish it up next week in part two of the data strategy conversation. Does that sound like a plan, Peter?
that sounds like a plan. I think we have a lot to cover, and especially today. I know you and I were speaking about it earlier today, and as I was going through the list of topics that we wanted to cover, I realized you and I would both have to be on speed to cover everything that we were initially going to try to do in this one podcast. So yeah, I think it's best to split. But I think, like you said, I think that the place to start is, and since you originally came up with the name, is how do we get the name all in on data? I think because that's really kind of our defining principles. I guess it defines us as an organization and where we'd like to go.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great story because it sort of encapsulates everything that I think you and I both believe in around AI and data, and that is we were looking around the market, looking around what people are doing as AI became more and more popular, and everyone wanted to adopt AI, and there was so much focus on the artificial intelligence models, the algorithms, the tools, and I think we felt like there just wasn't enough focus on the data. And AI obviously does not work without data. AI is built on data. And I remember sketching ideas for like how to take that concept and make it a name. And at one point I wrote AI on data and I wrote data below AI. And I was like, okay, that's a simple picture. It says AI is built on data, data foundational to AI. And then
Mhm.
realizing that the world is going all in on AI, and suddenly all in on data as a play on words, it's AI on data, is was born. So
And here we are today. And you and I, and all the customer conversations we've had, and I think this is what differentiates us from, I think, some other organizations, is our focus is really on, at least initially, data and doing it the right way and having a foundation upon which to build some of these models. And I think sometimes that gets lost in the fray, and a lot of organizations don't focus on that aspect of it, or they focus on a very small aspect of it. But with the advent of AI and these large models and companies having so much information, it is really foundational to have a strategy around data.
absolutely, and it's, as you said, it's easy for companies to focus on, can I get the people that know how to do this stuff? Can I get the technology? And can I license the right AI models? And they forget about the data aspect of it. And
Right.
a company that has not done much to care for and manage and curate their data just isn't going to be successful with AI.
Right. Right. Now, Dave, let's a little role reversal here, because you and I are actually different in terms of practitioners, and you're much more the data, as being a chief data officer numerous times. You're the most person that's much more focused on data strategy and evolving and data catalogs and that, whereas I'm more the engineer and would very often sidestep everything to get what I needed to get something done. But it is obviously we it is incredibly important to have the right strategies. I want to ask you, in starting this conversation, you're walking into an organization. Where do you start? Like, where do you go with this? How do you get a real data strategy up and off the ground and going?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the key thing that has made it easier to have a data strategy conversation is that we can have a conversation now about how a data strategy actually supports someone's business objectives and especially their AI strategy. I think let's rewind a few years when sort of the first generation of chief data officers were taking their roles, maybe at banks, maybe at retailers, or a number of industries that were sort of leading that curve.
Right.
But what they were doing was generally focused on some form of risk prevention and good hygiene. They were cleaning up data. They were trying to lower costs. They were trying to ease regulatory reporting burdens, etc. And so it's stuff that has to get done correctly. But if you do it correctly, you're not really getting anybody excited because you're just preventing a problem from occurring. But you're not creating change, you're not creating new capabilities. So it was a harder conversation to talk about data strategy 10 years ago than it is now. Now I think that most organizations and most business leaders readily agree that their data is one of their significant assets. The Economist came out with the article about data is the new oil so long ago that it's become a little bit of a trope, but people generally believe that. They agree that data is something of significant value. What you and I have been doing is helping people connect the dots, that data is also absolutely a foundational part of any AI initiative. So I think the job of creating the idea that there should be a strategy for how you manage and use this data has gotten a little bit easier the last few years.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right. I think there's still battles to be fought and changes that need to take place fundamentally before organizations really, I think, fully embrace it. And I still think to a degree you have a lot of organizations that will managers that will push back. It's always the common the tug of war back and forth. It's I have to get stuff done. How do I do something that's seemingly theoretical or not real? In reality, we know it is real, but seemingly not. It's not going to help my day job. We know it is. In practicality, it is. But for a person, for an engineer, for a manager trying to get something out the door for a business, it very often falls by the way. And I think that's always been the challenge.
Yeah, and honestly, I think in many cases that's probably a symptom of a strategy that is underdeveloped. Because if that strategy is not fully fleshed out and isn't balanced, and we'll talk about that balancing act,
Right.
I hope, in a little while here, if it's not balanced and defined well, then it becomes less obvious how to connect that strategy to the business outcomes that one is looking for. And it's easier to ignore because you don't see the value that it adds.
And I think that's absolutely true. I think you don't see the value. I think let's take a step even further than that. I think most organizations don't view data as you and I view data as something that is really it's incredibly valuable to driving business value. And I remember I learned this many years ago. I was doing work for I was working at a financial firm, and I was embarking on, and this is way back when analytics really wasn't in the vernacular of most people. In fact, most people I worked with thought it was something that shouldn't be done. Well, we don't need to do data analytics. We have quants, like different domain, and pulling data together to do real analytics at the time was very hard. But it became very evident to me very quickly that having a way of putting all this together and pulling literally hundreds of data sources together into some kind of cohesive format to actually drive value was incredibly important. I still think there's a disconnect, though, for a lot of organizations. They don't see the value in bringing together a multitude of data sources and managing data as a product, as something that's critical, and not just a side effect of doing something else. Don't you think that might still be the case?
I think that's right. I think they're still trying to connect the dots and understand where the data really fits into the process. It's interesting because today I think technology is inseparable from data, and data is inseparable from a business process. But I don't think that's obvious to everybody until they start looking at a data strategy, a well-formed, a proper data strategy. And there's a lot of bad data strategies out there. There's a lot more of them are, I'll just say, incomplete, insufficiently fleshed out, don't have a broad enough scope, etc. But hopefully that's what we can help with a little bit in our conversation today, and maybe demystify a little bit of what is this data strategy and why do you actually care, right?
Right. So let's jump in. So what is a data strategy to an organization that doesn't have one? And let's take a good, like, some of the companies that we speak to, mid-sized companies, and look, you can be $1 billion organization, and most certainly you probably don't have a data strategy from what we've seen. Where do you start? Like when you walk into an org for the first time and you say, okay, David, I'm bringing Dora, like I want you to walk me through what you do.
Yeah. I mean, I think the important part is not to make it sound too complicated, right? There is, as with anything, to do it well, there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of details, but let's start with the simplest definition. What's a data strategy? It's simply I'll say a plan of action and a statement of your intentions for what you're going to do to use data and what you're going to do for that data. In other words, to make the data more usable over a period of maybe 24 to 36 months. Right?
Right.
It's that simple. It's what am I going to do to make sure that I can use data and to make sure that the data is fit for use in the next couple of years.
Right.
Very casually.
Now, how do you trickle that mindset? Because that's great when you have it and it's written, it's on paper, but how do you trickle that mindset throughout the organization? Because I always find that
Yeah.
in order for these types of strategies to be effective, it really has to be trickled down from the lowest levels to the highest levels. And you have to kind of shift your view on how you view data just in general so that it becomes a, wow, data is it's a real tool. It's not just a byproduct of something. It's something that I need to look at a lot differently in order to get real value out of it organizationally.
I think there's a couple of things that you can do there. One is it starts with the ownership of the data strategy itself. The way I would say, so most typically in an organization today, if there is a chief data officer, that's the person who is usually responsible for creating and maintaining a data strategy, but it could be any other role. The important thing is that person is the custodian of the data strategy. They're not the owner. The owner is the whole business. And so it starts with something as fundamental as making sure that you've got the whole business involved in the formulation of the data strategy. And second, that you have and this actually becomes part of the strategy too, which is that you have a continuous plan and program for how you communicate not just the strategy, but how you communicate about the value of data, how you communicate about the right way to use data, and sort of help the whole organization think more comprehensively about the value of data and what it means to them. So it's that sort of 1-2 punch of share it broadly and invest in upskilling the whole organization to be more data aware or data centric.
Right. And it's funny you should say that. So I remember when I started out my career eons ago, um, back in the late 80s. I remember reading a book back then, and it was I had gone on this kick of reading a lot of manager books, and somehow I stumbled on the works of W. Edwards Deming. And Deming, for those who don't know, really revived Japan post World War II with some of his innovations. MIT professor wrote about statistics and applying, doing data, basically doing data-driven decision making at the time, which had a profound impact on me for the rest of my career. So I think for you and me, this stuff is intuitive. It's obvious. We look at information. Like I've walked into organizations and I've seen, a petabyte of data sitting around and nothing's being used together. It's all used in isolation. I look, or you look, and we go, there's $100 million in value sitting here. They're not looking at it that way. How do you get that mindset? Even if you have a piece of paper that lays it out, but it's a fundamental shift in thinking for an
Yeah.
org to
It,
look at it
it,
differently.
that's a really good point. And it's funny because nothing makes a data strategy feel less connected to the organization than having it age poorly, right? So you mentioned Deming, and I'll paraphrase him poorly, which is one of the things he's famous for saying is that a strategy should not be a binding plan. It's rather a statement of intention.
Right.
And you should therefore be able to revise and change that strategy as needs dictate. And that's the other interesting part of a data strategy is it's got to be flexible. It's got to be adaptable. It's got to be a living, breathing document. I tell people that they should revisit the strategy and reconfirm the strategy with the business at least on an annual basis. Although to be honest, I would probably lean towards doing it more frequently than that. And also anytime the situation changes, right? If you announce a new
Right.
corporate strategy, merger and acquisition or something like that, you absolutely should use that as a trigger. So part of that is you've got to keep it fresh and relevant and meaningful to people.
Right.
It's important, and I think that sometimes you hear the word strategy, and I think a lot of people hear that word and they say, okay, well that doesn't really apply to me. I have a job. My job has guardrails. I know what I'm doing.
Right.
Strategy is someone else's department.
Well, strategy is always looked at as, if you're the guy in the trenches writing the code from a day-to-day basis and, supporting a business or a product or whatever it may be, you're thinking of the strategy folks are those guys that sit over in the corner, write, presentations and are decoupled from reality.
Right.
And nothing can be further from the truth. And I honestly, as an engineer, was thinking the same way for a good part of my career. And it's only as I've gotten older and more experienced, I realize there is enormous value in these strategies, but they have to apply at the whole level. And they can't be decoupled from the day to day. They can't be removed from the guys in the trenches that actually have to do this stuff. And I think that's kind of where a lot of things always fell apart.
I think you're right. So as we go through what goes into a good data strategy, let's try to call out the real impacts that this has, the real ways that this strategy should articulate how different people do parts of their job every day. Because if that strategy isn't directly connected to what they do every day, they'd be right to feel like it was someone else's job. Like that would be a terrible, terrible outcome if you had a strategy that people couldn't identify with and say, all right, I see what this is telling me to do. No matter what my job is, I see what
Right.
I need to do to support this strategy. And I think the other part that's interesting is companies have a lot of strategies, right? Like there is all sorts of other strategies and plans and standards and policies that sit around a company. So how do you differentiate the data strategy from all of these other strategies, right? That's a challenge sometimes.
Well, differentiate it or incorporate it amongst all the other strategies. I mean, how do you do that? How do you make it part of an employee's thinking on a regular basis that these are when I create information as a side product of my processes, that this is something I could use, that I can make money off of, that I could, becomes valuable to the company. And it's not just, I created a widget, that's great, but all that other information I created about the creation of that widget is, it's meaningless when in reality we know it's not.
Right. Well, I think it's been, I hope it's been generally accepted for a long time now that, if you're in a well-run, well-functioning company, you should be able to look at the projects you work on, then to tasks you do, and you should be able to connect those in some way, shape, or form to the business strategy of the company, right? What am I doing? What am I supporting? Is this
Right.
application I'm developing working on a corporate objective we have to increase customer satisfaction, for example, right? So you should be able to draw that connection. I think there's a similar set of connections between the data strategy and other strategies. So let's look at technology. Technology, there will be a technology strategy in many organizations, and it isn't identical to the data strategy, but it's got some overlap. It's got some areas where the data strategy will put, I'll say, requirements on the technology strategy that will call out things that the technology strategy needs to accomplish.
Right.
And there can be vice versa too. The technology strategy may impose limitations on the data strategy, right? So you may have a technology strategy that says our cloud migration is going to take this long to occur. And the data strategy needs to deal with that timeline in reality. It can't be operating on its own timeline that doesn't line up with the technology strategy. But they are two different things, right? The technology strategy might be dealing with things like cloud migration timelines and data center relocations and network upgrades and security enhancements. But there's going to be overlap. There's going to be really important things where they need to be synced up. And I think,
Mhm.
so one of the battles is how do you make sure your data strategy aligns to the technology strategy? Probably, for me, the more important one is business strategy. And
I
this
was
is
just going to
one
ask that question.
yeah. I mean, I had someone ask me a few months ago, what is the difference between my business strategy and a data strategy? And I thought about it for a while and I realized the short answer is not much.
It's
Now,
yes.
right, the details are different, but that data strategy ought to be completely anchored in and tied to the business strategy. There is no such thing as a good data strategy in the abstract. There's a good data strategy for a company based on its business strategy.
Right.
But that may be totally different than what is a good data strategy for a different company.
Right. Now, do you think a good data strategy can drive business strategy,
Yes,
or
yeah,
vice versa, or
it,
both?
it, it's both. I mean, I think at the end of the day, when I said the difference is not much, I think that there are some common elements of them. A data strategy absolutely needs to be focused on helping to achieve the business objectives, but conversely, those business objectives probably need to be shaped and informed by what's realistic in a data strategy. Right. So let's take a real
Right.
example. If someone said, I want to have a fully automated digital interface on mobile devices for my customers that recognizes them no matter where they are and gives them their next investment recommendation, making
Right.
something, right? If you know from a data perspective that you are 18 months away from integrating your customer databases and having a 360 view of your customer, that information should shape that business objective, because you may therefore conclude that fully reaching that objective in 12 months is not possible because you've got some prerequisite data work to do. So everything you do in data should directly or indirectly contribute to the business strategy, but the business strategy is also dependent upon some of the data capabilities that you are building.
Right. Now, do you think it from like, you and I have obviously worked in a lot of big organizations, and I found that when I implemented some of this stuff, it was an educational process for a lot of the business people that I was working with. I think most business users, and I think this is also partly generational too. A lot of people that have been around for a long time are still, they're not driven empirically, they're driven by gut. And it took a long time for me to shape their thinking that, yeah, your gut's great, but very often your gut doesn't jive with data and empirical reality. And it took a long time. It took over the period of a couple of years to say, hey, look, where we have this information, we're using it, you think X, reality points to Y. But once they made that transition, it took a long time to get them there and to see the real value of all this information that we had saved for years, that it's been sitting there largely unused.
Yeah, that's a great example. There's a story I have told quite a few times in the last decade of being at a bank, and the CEO basically looked at me and said, "I will know that you are successful in your role as chief data officer when person X over here, who's a senior executive who'd been with the bank for more than 30 years, and he said when person X goes against 30 years of experience with these large corporate customers and goes against his received wisdom and instead trusts a piece of data and a report that we gave him and makes a decision different than what he would have been inclined to make otherwise."
Right.
Great. Always stuck with me as, okay, this is what I
Mhm. Yeah.
actually have to accomplish. So
Right.
it's interesting because I think there's a couple of things implicit in that when you break it apart. I mean, one is just you have to build trustworthy data and trustworthy analytics. And so a lot of components of the data strategy are addressing how do you make sure that the data is trustworthy, that the analytics are accurate and trustworthy, because you can't ask someone to trust slapdash analytics.
Right.
So that's on the data team to create the right analytics and the right data. But the interesting flip side is there's a human factor too, which I think is what you've run into many times in your life, right? How do you get the people to think differently about the value of data?
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
I think half what we do is psychology, honestly, at the end of the day. I think so
that's
much of what, yeah, we're engineers, but convincing people to use all this information and look at it objectively or differently it is psychology. And I have a very similar story to you. I was working with somebody for a long time who 30 years of experience as a bond salesman, knew everything about his customers. And until the day he showed up and, proceeded to tell everybody he was wrong, and that he had adopted everything that we had done because he realized that there was enormous value, and it was an eye-opening event for me. But I think that was the inflection point to the organization becoming far more data empirical driven than it was in the past.
yeah, yeah. That's I love
But
that. I love that story. I wish I could say that there was always that like moment of epiphany when someone would say you were right, but it's
right,
usually
you
it's a
don't
little
get
more
it.
subtle and more gradual.
Hey, I'll even take that. I mean,
Yeah,
but this happened to be one of those outliers that was like an oh my god moment, which it never happened again. But that one was an awesome example. But again, the data
you're gonna have
strategy.
your Hollywood
So I
moment
mean,
right there.
and that was the only one I'm ever getting. It's never happening again.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I always used to say in some of my early CDO jobs that I felt like my job was, part cheerleader and part psychiatrist, trying to help people get over
Right.
their angst around data and distrust of company databases and data and things like that. And so there is this human aspect of it that goes by a lot of different names. I mean, I think we previously referenced that there is a big sort of human behavior and training and education component to a data strategy. And what you're speaking about, I sort of consider to be a scientific method or rational thought processes. How do you get people to actually get to a place where they are using data the right way? And, sometimes people will talk about things like data-driven decision making, which is good. But I also want to say I don't love every implication of the phrase data-driven decision making,
No.
because I think that it's more than just what we consciously recognize as decisions. It should be that every action we take, whether we recognize it as a decision or not, is informed by data. And
Right.
this is I'll go on a little bit of a tangent here, but you and I are both, we'll say, of a sufficient age to have remembered when we talked about MIS systems. Do you remember MIS?
Oh, yes.
Management
Absolutely.
Information Systems. Yep.
Yep.
I look back on it now and I laugh at the idea of management information systems, because everything about them, or sometimes even worse, called executive information systems, it was so elitist and it was so
Yep.
wrong. Maybe it was right for the time because it was incredibly hard and expensive to build reporting systems. We didn't have BI tools. We didn't have the kinds of capabilities we have today. But what I really dislike about that phrase is it sort of anchored for a lot of people the idea that analytics are for strategic decision making, and that the people in the C-suite were the only ones who made big decisions and therefore should have data to support those decisions.
Right. I think you're absolutely correct. Um, Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's not the case. I think this kind of information has to be, and it's the outputs from this information need to be part of everybody's job and everybody within the organization to really get the real value out of it. And I think you look at some really sophisticated orgs, you know, companies that have grown up in the last decade or 2 decades or so, that started out as true analytic data driven firms. Google, any of the socials I think are good examples, but there are many others out there. It's really it is part of their core decision making, not just top managers, but for everybody. Everybody gets to see this information. Almost everybody, they understand the value of it. It's part of the day to day. It informs their day to day decision making. It's not just a bunch of people sitting in the C suite someplace looking at this information and driving decisions from there, which is wrong because you're not using this information to its maximum potential.
Yeah, and there has been a little bit of a surge lately for people talking about democratization of information, and
Right.
I think it's a powerful force, and I think we need to help continue to push the message that there's virtually nobody with a role in an organization, no matter what your role is and no matter what the organization is, virtually nobody with a role that couldn't do their job better with more information, or that requires some information to do their jobs. So a data strategy is really meant to, and this goes back to your question earlier too, about how do you make sure everybody gets it, everybody feels connected to it. You need to be looking at everybody in the organization and how you can support them with data.
One, I think something that's changed dramatically here, and I think why you and I wind up speaking about this quite a bit to a lot of different companies. It's yes, there's the need of a data strategy, but I think with the tools have gotten so sophisticated, especially with all the AI models that are out there today, and being able to ingest and utilize and derive some real actionable information from what were traditionally non-standard models or non-standard data sources has gotten incredibly easy. So, even conversations that you and I have had with customers, it's like, oh, you have X. Oh, we can use that now. And in the past, we would have been never, it's too hard. But now, because it almost overnight, because there's so many of these alternative sources that you never would have been thought to use, the amount of data available for decision making has grown more than exponentially. So,
That's a really interesting perspective, and I think it's cool because if you look at any sufficiently complicated transaction or event in the life of a business, right? The data that actually gets into a structured database to capture that loses all the nuance, right? It captures
right,
the bare bones of it. So if you've got a large deal that's a corp to corp business and you're negotiating for 8 months to close a purchase order with a large customer, that PO goes into your system, and it has the date and the items and the quantity and the discount. Nothing in that application database tracks everything that went on for 8 or 12 months to get to the point where you created that. Now, you might have a little bit in your CRM system and other systems, but I think what you're pointing at is I don't blame people for sometimes being suspect about the data in their systems because it doesn't reflect the entirety of the way the business runs. And a lot of that other data that does capture how the business runs is sitting in emails and documents and all of those unstructured data sources that you were referring to.
Context is lost, I think, is really what you're trying to say here. And years ago when I was building trading systems, we were trying to capture context on why did somebody do this trade. And it was hard to do at the time, so there really wasn't an official way of doing it. But now, like you and I have said multiple times, we all have a massive digital footprint. Everything that we do is captured someplace. This recording is obviously captured. Our Slack messages, our email messages, our text messages, our voices. I mean, if you're working at an org, virtually everything you do is captured someplace. And that provides a lot of context and information that in the past was unusable. Unless you needed to pull it up for some regulatory reason, that information was lost. Now that information, we can derive a lot of context of what goes around and make different calls. And I think that's the thing that has changed dramatically. It's look, you and I, we're sitting on a call. When we set, when the world moved to Zoom calls, and you're now all of a sudden meeting people who you've never met before in a Zoom call, so much context is lost. We're not two-dimensional representations of ourselves. There's so much that's lost by not seeing us face to face, by not shaking a person's hand. And I think similarly with this is there's so much content that's generated that's not being used that would provide so much more context and make decision making just that much more richer. If only we can pull from it and use it, which now we can.
Yep, absolutely true. I think it's a great idea. Or it's a great concept and great to keep in mind because it also sort of plays into a question people have asked me before. It's just like, well, who really needs a data strategy? Like, am I a big enough company to need one, or does my company need a data strategy? And I would say that given that now there is, in the last couple of years, without adding any storage, companies have doubled, tripled, quintupled, or more the amount of available data to them just because they can get to that unstructured data in an economically feasible way that they couldn't before. So I don't think there's a company out there that doesn't need some flavor of a data strategy. Would you agree with that, or am I taking it too
Oh,
far?
100%. No, I don't think you're taking it too far. And I think, though, and this is why I want to drill down a little further, to two things really. One, what does a data strategy really look like? Is it one page? Is it a book? Is it something you go off and spend, 4 months in a room writing, or is it something that really becomes a living, breathing document that starts small and spreads out over time?
Yeah.
Where do you start?
Yeah, good question. So let's roll back to, do I need one, right? And I think you and I both agree. The answer is yes. If you're listening to this podcast, you need a data strategy, probably. Mom, if
Yeah,
you're listening,
yeah,
you might not need one, but everyone else probably does.
needs one.
Yeah, and I would say, look, if you're big enough to have a technology budget, if you spend $100,000 a year equivalent or more, and you have some defined technology roles, you probably have a technology strategy. It might be a page, it might be 10 pages, and you probably need a data strategy. If you care about the way that you spend money on technology and data, and you care that it supports the way your business operates and that it drives you towards new business objectives, you need a data strategy. The only situation I could actually think of for a company that doesn't need a data strategy is either a really tiny company, and I would argue that that's just a matter of you will need a data strategy, you just don't yet if you grow. And the other might be a truly static business. I don't know if you can even name one, Peter, but like think about a business that never changes,
Risks.
right? It doesn't want to grow, it doesn't add customers, it doesn't lose customers, nothing changes in the operating environment, it's just static. It's just someone's just turning the handle and they don't want to change anything. I guess for a static business, you probably don't need a data strategy as long as your data is working for you today.
Well, I think you're going to stay a static business unless you have a strategy. I'll take that
Right,
approach because I
right.
truly think that you need to have something if you want to grow. And the competition, because if you don't have one, I think the competition is going to have one. Whether they wrote it down or not, I
Yeah.
mean, maybe they have it in their heads, but they certainly. have some approach to using information effectively.
Good point.
So,
So turn that around. If you don't want to change anything about your business, if you don't want to improve anything about your business, maybe you don't need a data strategy, because
right
I would argue a
now, when
data
you say that,
strategy is about building. After you.
right? No, go finish. I apologize. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I just would say it's about building capabilities. It's about improving the business, right? So, if you have any interest in growing your business, a data strategy will be part of that, I think.
Right now, so again,
The
let's
other,
let's go back to the
yeah,
practical. No, I was going to
yep,
practical applications or the practical starting point, because I'm sure there are those listening in on us. And, again, you and I have been around for a long time, and you see these organizations crop up within a company, and, they are strategy in nature. They produce a lot of decks, and then those decks go into the proverbial bit bucket. And nobody ever sees them, or they're read once and they go away. And, or the big consulting firms of the world come in and, tell you, oh, you're going to do this, and this is how you're going to do it. And then they kind of go nowhere. And I like seeing stuff done, being an engineer. Um, you walk in day one. So it's like, okay, I'm walking into $1 billion org. I'm tasked with putting together a strategy within a couple of weeks. Who do I talk to? Who do I approach? Where do I start? How do I get the word out? Like, what do I do?
yep. So, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, it's a real data strategy. A good data strategy is something that covers an entire organization, right? Because you need all the parts of the organization working together to achieve the business objectives, and the data strategy is part and parcel of those business objectives. But, so ideally, you walk in and you start with senior executive leadership and you start working through some of the business objectives and relate that to where you are with data and where you want to be. And we'll talk in a little bit about kind of the structure of how that can be laid out. But I think it's an important point to note that just because you don't run the whole company doesn't mean you can't have a data strategy. So you can create a departmental or a divisional data strategy. You can create a data strategy for your team if you need to. Now,
Right.
your ability to place demands on other parts of the organization, your ability to steer some of the technology agenda for the organization may be different, may be more limited than if you're driving this top down. But if you don't have a top down data strategy, you can start with a departmental or a team data strategy. Would you agree with that, Peter?
Well, 100%. Absolutely. I very often think I mean, look, there are different approaches in any organization. The bottom up sometimes is more effective than the top down approach. So yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think, if you're a small organization, if you're even a 100-person tech, organization, you could absolutely put together a strategy around this. Most definitely. I think, and you're foolish not to.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. And ideally, your input is part of a broader data strategy for the whole company. But if that isn't where the company is, then create your own. And all the guidelines, all of the things we're going to talk about as we continue to explore this are going to be relevant, whether you're talking about a team level, a department level, divisional, or an enterprise data strategy. So, so
Right. Now,
what does it look like? I mean, you're. It's funny you mentioned like that sometimes we just produce lots of paper. Not you and I, but like companies produce
right.
lots of paper. There's an old joke about the value of a methodology being measured in linear board feet. Yeah, how much does it take up on a shelf?
Yep.
We've all seen that, and the last thing we want is for this strategy to be shelfware. So I think one of the other considerations is what form it takes, right? Like, and you said, is it a page? When someone says, how big should my data strategy be? And my honest answer is as big as it needs to be, given one, that it's appropriate for the current state of your organization, two, that it addresses what it needs to address, and three, that people are going to read it. So if
Right.
the culture of your organization is that no one's going to read a 50-page document, don't write a 50-page document, right? If the culture of your organization is that people hate slide decks, don't make the data strategy a slide deck. I've even seen, so true story, I have seen data strategies that have been slickly produced brochures in which a company brought in a graphic design company and created a almost a comic book style brochure about the data strategy. And a lot of people rolled their eyes when they saw that, but you know what? People read it. Not only did people read it, they kept it out on the corner of their desk sometimes. And it became part of the lore of that company. So
Now, was that cultural? Was that culturally driven?
it in this case, and I worked closely with the person who put it together. In this case, it was a decision we made that was driven by the fact that there were already too many stodgy documents out there. And if we released a data strategy, it would have been the 110th document for someone to read, and people weren't reading them anyway. There were so many that were mandatory reading that all the others that weren't required by some rule or regulation were sort of less deeply read, we'll say. So we took a gamble and said, maybe this will stand out and it'll get people interested, and it'll also take
Right.
what is a dry topic and turn it into a more accessible topic.
Right.
And, the trade-off is maybe it doesn't have the level of detail in it that a 50-page document would have, but a 20-page document that people read is more impactful than a 50-page document that people stick on the shelf behind their desk.
Now, what about having different types of methods of communicating with the various levels within an organization? Like maybe a software developer at a college wants a two-page, you know what I'm saying?
Oh,
And the
yeah.
top wants something completely different, having, or maybe
Yep.
wants, or maybe they want it on TikTok. I don't know. I mean, it's the way of getting it.
I have to admit, I have never created a TikTok data strategy video. I'll put that on my bucket list. Um,
Yeah, ditto. Neither have
but
I.
yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think there is no wrong answer when it comes to different ways to socialize and share the strategy. Right? It could be a set of videos. It could be posters. It could be lunch and learn sessions and workshops. There's no wrong answer, and in fact,
Right.
the only wrong answer is not to socialize it effectively. Right?
Right, right, 100%. I want to say wait for 1 second, only because I know there was a comment posted in the chat room that I thought was pretty interesting, and
Yes.
I think was something we should probably bring up. And I'll paraphrase, and then you and I think can riff on this a little bit more. It's
Okay.
one perspective, and you had brought up MIS system, which I think was important given our age and where they were back when you and I started out. But one perspective is the objective of modern MIS systems is to provide systems that orchestrate information flows across silos and hierarchies of entire organizations to communicate, collaborate, and execute. And it's not just for managers to look at anymore. And this is from Joe Jackson, who I know personally. It's great comments. But your thoughts on that, David? I want to just work that into this because I think it's important. Because
Yeah.
to me, having a data strategy, especially in a large organization, it is absolutely it's even more critical.
Right. I do agree. So I think Gerald raises a good point, which is that ability to orchestrate information and show the big picture of what's happening across disparate parts of an organization is hugely important. And let's face it, it's a lot easier in many cases to use the lens of a dashboard or an MIS report to give you visibility into the whole organization than it is to actually tear down those silos and build a brand new organization that is, perfectly integrated. That's sort of a pipe dream. So I think
Right.
there is a massive value. My only objection to MIS is that the unfortunate side effect of management information systems is, as we talked about, the fact that it sort of conveys the idea that only certain people are entitled to this information. And I agree, though, it's the value of a dashboard, a management dashboard, an MIS system, whatever you call it, is absolutely a valid thing to create. It has a lot of value. I just, if you look back, and anyone under 50 probably won't remember these days, but if you look back, whole departments used to be called the MIS departments, right?
Right.
There wasn't an analytics department; it was the MIS department, and that's what I was sort of
Right.
pushing
Right.
back against, because that very much created the elite sector of the company that got access to data, and everyone else just had to muddle along the best they could. And it's funny
Right.
because I'm sure we'll talk about this when we, especially next week when we dive into more of the details of the data strategy. But the unfortunate side effect of that, the unintended consequence, is it created a black market of data in most companies, which is if
Right.
you needed data, how did you get it? If you had no official way to get access to data, people started the phone a friend network. Hey, do you have a file that shows this? Sure, I'll send you that file, And we got this environment in which there were thousands and thousands or tens of thousands of data transfers, poorly documented or not documented at all, flying around, and yet that's how a lot of the
Right.
business ran.
Well, and you bring up a story which I had completely forgotten about from a system that I ran a long time ago when I ran some data warehousing system for one of the banks, and it was a feed generation system. And every night we would generate, on average, it was I want to say it was around 2,000 feeds that were risk and trading feeds that were sent to various parts of the organization. If you followed it all the way to the end state, there were, I think, winds up going 5 levels deep. So I get calls from people who had received data from systems that had originally gotten it from me, and what was wrong with the data. Mind you, had gone through multiple transformations, and it was no strategy around it. It was like you said, copy. I need information. How do I get it? I get it from the person that's going to give it to me the fastest, regardless if it's good or it's bad. If it's bad, I'm going to call the person who supposedly originated it. But that was the way we did. That's the way we operated. And the same holds true for any kind of reference data systems. How many of us have been in places where there are 7 copies of an address database,
Yeah.
all different?
Right, right. It's a real problem, and a big part of the data strategy needs to get to how do you technically resolve that problem, but also how do you change the behavior. Right? You've mentioned human behavior a lot of times, and it's a behavioral problem as much as it is a governance and a technology problem. I just want to say, Gerald, thank you for the question. And if you have any pictures of Peter from back in the days when he used to wear a coat and tie, send those to us because I really want to see them.
I'll bring them to the next meeting. I promise you. And a
Uh,
mustache, but we'll delete those from.
all right, that yes. I think what we need to do is we need to use AI to generate a live motion avatar based on one of your old photos with a mustache,
I think we can.
and
I think we
I'll
can
dig out
do
a
that.
photo of me with hair, and we'll have our a
I
podcast
think
with
we
our
can.
AI avatars from many years ago.
I will happily do that just to make fun of ourselves. And the funny thing was, you and I met. We were both wearing suits and ties every single day. Now I'm not even
Yeah.
sure I can tie a tie. I'm not even sure I can tie a tie anymore. It's been so long.
No, I don't. I don't think I remember how to tie a tie.
I'm not sure I
Yep.
want to remember to tie a
I don't
tie.
even remember how to button my top button.
And mind you, David wears
So,
Hawaiian shirts every day
anyway,
now.
that's the way it should be. Yeah,
Yes, exactly. I
yeah.
completely agree. And every day should
No,
look
I
like it
only.
does behind me as well.
That's right. That's right. And just for the record, I only wear Hawaiian shirts on special occasions, like doing the Call Me Data podcast. See, I got the name right that time too. But I'm running low on shirts, and I don't want to recycle, so I'm gonna have to get a few more. But you got to get
So
the
if anybody
real
wants to
made
send
in
David
Asia.
shirts, I would encourage it. I would encourage anybody to send David as many Hawaiian shirts as you would like.
Oh, this could backfire very badly.
I think we should. I'll
Ay,
send you
ay,
some from
ay.
down here.
Yeah. Um, Well,
Anyway,
let's go back to what we were talking about too, which is like the strategy, and that you need to socialize it, you need to communicate it, you need to get people on board with it. I would say this: there's lots of short, easy, appealing, accessible ways to communicate pieces of the strategy, but you also need to balance that with don't let it be what I'll call an implied strategy. Be explicit. Write it down,
right,
right? Or record it somewhere. Get the details right. It doesn't mean that you have to share every detail with every person. Some people will want to read the executive summary version. Some people will want to watch the TikTok video,
right.
right? So, yes, but take the care and get it right and be explicit. A strategy
I,
that is implied isn't really a strategy, it's a dream, it's a wish. And we all know what those are
right.
worth.
And just
So
one
yeah.
one one car. God, I'm sorry.
No, after you, please.
Now, one corollary I want to use for my days of building systems, and I think we've all seen these where there are goals to build these monolithic large systems that are very complex, and you want to go out day one with this. And requirements get bigger and bigger as the days go by. And it starts out as a 30-man project, becomes a 100-man project, and things are always way behind schedule, and you never wind up getting what you initially started out. The systems that I at least personally have built over the years, the ones that have been the most successful, are the ones that started small with a handful of developers. And the reason I say this, the key thing was they solved the problem, they solved it well, and then they evolved over time. And maybe 4 years later, there were teams of 50 or 60 people managing those systems, but they started very small. And I think the same almost applies here. When you put a 50-page document on somebody's desk, honestly, I think most people will get through the first 2 pages and they'll never get past that. And I think if you start small, start focused, start on some key points that are valid, just to, I think, you look, part of this, I think, is social engineering at the end of the day. You have to get people thinking this way. And even analytics, when it was new and BI was new, it was a whole rethinking. People had to rethink things differently. It had to become a little bit more empirically driven. And I think the same holds true with this. You have to start adjusting people's perception of data and how to use this information properly. And I think it's almost best to put some core information, some key thoughts in their head to start the process. And then over the course of 6 to 18 months, you start layering on more information and building a bigger story, so it gets richer and richer and richer. So it becomes more part of how they think on a regular basis.
Yeah,
You think?
I do. I think that's a really important point. I'm sure in my past lives I've been the person who shows up at the cocktail party and someone says, "What do? You work with data. What's that all about?" And 30 minutes later, after I've gone, here's what we do. People are like, "Whoa, okay, sorry, I missed." Um, right. So I don't want that to happen, and it's one of the reasons that we put together the framework that we've put together, which is,
Right.
there's a list of topics, and that list of topics is admittedly long. There is a look. You can't get around the fact that to do AI well, to use data effectively, there's actually a considerable list of things you have to get right. But
Right.
you don't have to present someone a 200 item checklist and say, "Here you go, you got to get all this stuff right." What you're saying is 100% right. We've broken it into a few different levels, and we start with some high level, hey, your strategy needs to reflect these things. And then you can decompose iteratively and take people on the journey. So I think
Right.
that's a good point. And the other point about that is there's no one size fits all strategy. Like, people can look at this list of items, and some people might say, "Well, do I really need all that?"
Right.
And I would say you don't necessarily need all these things right now, because it's a little bit. Remember in psychology class, Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Of course.
Yep. So that comes into play. Depending on where you are and what your level of maturity is, you may not need to worry about everything on this list yet, but you will if you continue to grow and prosper.
Right.
And I know, like an example
Right.
that came up when I was talking to someone the other day was one of the details of a data strategy is how do you identify something often called authoritative data sources, which is, okay, if I've got 100 people that have this type of data, how do I know which is the right place to go and get it? How do I get closer to having that single source of truth? For some companies, that's a
Right.
non-issue. Maybe they are small from a technology footprint and they only run on a couple of application systems, and there's no duplication of data across those applications, right?
Right.
So defining authoritative data systems is not really a concern they have right now.
It's
But
easy.
if that company acquires another company, if that company grows, if that company launches new products, expands into different countries, et cetera, there's any number of scenarios that could change the technology landscape where 2 years from now, that will be a priority. 2 years from now, they will
Right.
have challenges around identifying authoritative sources of data. So I think all of the things in the strategy, when we start going into the details, they're not all going to apply to everybody now, but they're all going to be important someday for most companies.
Right. Right. So it's safe to say that you can do some of this stuff. And, again, it's not an all or none. You have to do it incrementally in order to move the organization along. And I think part of the fear of a lot of places is, well, I got to do this. I get this deck. I got to do all this. And that's not reality. And then all of a sudden you get a lot of pushback. And that's the one thing you want to avoid is that level of pushback from everybody. You want them to go, oh, this is a good idea. Oh, I can learn this fairly quickly. I can start incorporating some of this into my work. And then over time, you kind of get them there. And then the other question I want to ask, because I know we're kind of running out of time, is, and we'll probably cover more of this in the next session, the tools enforce some of this to make it easier to do some of this work.
Yeah, it's so. Let's take both those points. I think you're 100% right. The idea should be, as the creator of a data strategy, I may have a list of 200 things I need to worry about. I'm going to pick my battles. I'm going to just focus on the ones that are relevant now. And as I go back and review that strategy on a regular basis, like we talked about earlier, I need to go back to that list and determine whether anything that I had previously omitted from the strategy is now becoming relevant and needs to be addressed. So the scope of that strategy might grow over time. But you brought up an excellent point around tissue rejection, which is you can't go and drop a 90-pound strategy document on someone's desk without expecting them to have a lot of reactions, none of which is good. And I think the tooling part is a little more interesting because I think we talked about using technology to help share what the strategy is. The other really cool part of this, and this will be let's put this on our list to talk about too, is I don't know what you call it. I sort of sometimes refer to it as policy as code, right? Which is can you take some of what you're trying to do and actually embed it into the way that your technology organization and business operates so that people aren't consciously making choices. You're actually using configuration of your technology to enforce some of your choices that you've made.
Right.
So,
No, I agree. I agree with what you said. I mean, in some sense, I think with companies that are not used to thinking this way and using data as effectively, uh, it's in some ways you're really changing the DNA of an organization. I think.
yeah.
What do you think about that?
I 100% agree. We'll talk about one of the pillars being this idea of a data centric culture. And I, when I talk about that to people, one of the things I always say is this isn't a data centric culture that you instill in a subset of the people who are the people you consider data analysts or knowledge workers, right? This is everybody in the organization. Everybody is in some way, shape, or form going to interact with data. They might be part of how data is collected. If I'm sitting in a call center fielding queries from customers, I'm collecting data from that customer, and I need to understand what's important to collect and how I should collect it to preserve the value of that data. How many people have seen call centers where a CRM system is configured and the call center is trained that they have to fill in something for this mandatory field about the nature of the customer question, right? But they either fill in garbage because it doesn't really help them close the ticket, but it's required, or they use some shorthand, or they fill in the same thing for every call. And that satisfies the technical requirement of not leaving that field blank before they can close the ticket. But
Right.
they don't, without the right awareness, they're missing the revelation that by not capturing a sufficient level of detail about what that call was about, they have just prevented us from being able to use those call logs in the future to analyze patterns of customer calls, to look for more subtle signals in all of the noise of these calls. And that's not entirely their fault, because that's also the fault of the person who wrote the policy that says, hey, this is just a required field. It's the fault of the manager who is compensating them solely on volume of calls closed, not on quality of information collected. So there's n number of people that are responsible for that. So I like that example because it sort of highlights like everybody needs to understand, how do you collect data? How do you manage data and protect it? And how do you use data effectively? Because everybody is doing at least one of those things in their job.
Right. Right. It's safe to say you think a modern organization is not going to survive without taking a much more data centric, data thinking approach.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. You will not thrive. You will not thrive. You will not leverage AI. You will not outgrow and outscale your competitors without effectively using data. And doing that requires virtually everybody in the organization to be equipped with the right knowledge, the right direction, the right tools to do that. And that's a big part of what a data strategy should be trying to achieve.
And I just want to make one thing clear. It's not just for organizations that are technology driven. That applies to virtually, I think, every organization out there, from the most basic manufacturing companies that are manufacturing simple things, and to the organizations that are technology driven and focusing on technology products. Or even if you're outsourcing massive parts of your organization, that strategy almost has to permeate down to the companies you're outsourcing in order to capture that information if you want to thrive and grow going forward. Because so many organizations outsource so much of their operations, and that data strategy ends at the door and it doesn't permeate all the way down, and they're losing critical parts of information.
Right. I couldn't agree with you more. It's almost it's challenging to think of any company that doesn't depend to some degree or another on data. Data that they create, data that they save, data that they use and ingest from other sources. It's the lifeblood of our economy.
Right.
As much as currency and payment is, as much as electricity and power, data is right up there. It's kind of funny. Never thought of it. Maybe earth, wind, fire, and data are the natural elements.
Come up with a graphic for that one.
That'll be our new band: Earth, Wind, Fire,
Yes,
and Data. Um,
that'll be wildly successful, I'm sure.
yeah. No, it is. I mean, yeah, data is the new element, right? That's maybe it's the new atomic element.
It's certainly foundational to every company out there.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. So
Yeah.
we've covered a lot, and funny enough, as I think this has been a fun conversation, we haven't even gotten into like, okay, what's the structure of the data strategy? What goes into it? So
No.
I guess next week we'll start with that, right?
Yeah, no, I think next week we touch on it. I mean, do you want to mention some of what we're going to just kind of a lead in over the things? Because obviously we've
Yeah,
spoken about a lot of stuff, but we haven't spoken about the brass tacks. How do you make all this stuff work, and what does it really look like?
yeah. What you want to give it? You want to give a preview of the six pillars?
I'm leaving that one to you.
All
You're
right,
better versed
all
than
right.
I am on this one.
Yeah, I mean the six pillars. The way I look at them is these critical pillars are number one, strategic alignment. How are you aligning the data objectives and what you're trying to do with data to the business, to your business priorities, to the constraints on your business, and to other objectives that you've defined for the business? So that's really saying, how do you make sure that your data strategy is part and parcel of your business strategy? Number two is, how do you do effective data and AI governance? We'll talk next week about all of the risks and downsides of having poorly governed data and poorly governed AI, especially because AI has its own set of unique risks and challenges. So how do you put controls and put some method to the madness? Number three is data management, which is a big, huge, loaded term. It means different
Yep.
things to everyone, but it's really about how are you taking this asset that we've just described as very valuable and actually managing it proactively. I always think of it this way, to give my analogy for
Mm.
data management. Um, if your business runs on cash, you're going to know where your cash is, right? You're going to have places where you physically store cash on premises. You're going to have accounts where you've deposited cash. You're going to know where that cash is. You're going to know who has access to it. And you're going to have a chart of
Right,
accounts maybe that tells you what you're using those different piles of cash for. If
right.
data is an
Now,
asset, why would you be any less detailed and less intentional about your data?
right, right.
So we'll,
No,
we'll
100%
dive into
right.
that one. You can tell I'm passionate about that. Pillar number four is data quality. And this is, I think, always an interesting one because there's a lot of facets we can talk about next week. I'll leave you with one thought, which is quality is not a binary thing. Data is not correct or incorrect. Data at an aggregate level is fit for purpose or not fit for purpose. But there's no
Right,
such thing as correct data when you're looking at a set of data.
right,
Number five is AI analytics development. So, okay, now you've got a strategy, it's aligned, you've got control of your data, you've got good quality data. How do you actually propose to create analytic and AI capabilities? What are they, and how are you going to do it? And then
right,
number six, which we have hinted at many times, is the people and culture aspect of this. How do you train people? How do you communicate to people? How do you influence them? How do you build a data centric culture? So those
right.
six pillars really are the foundation of a data strategy.
Right.
And as we said, each of them has a lot more detail behind it, which we will try to find a way to talk about in about an hour next week.
Yep.
Maybe we need to break
We
this into
will.
6 parts.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, and the point I want to hammer home because again, I've said this a couple of times is time to value. I think is important, and not coming up like these pillars are incredibly important, but making sure that you can get value out of this as quickly as possible without it being a 2-year process. I think because that's what scares everybody away. It's got to be okay. This is creating a strategy. How do I get benefit from it as quickly as possible, and then iterate there and over time incorporate it into my culture.
Absolutely. Well, good. Listen, this has been, as always, Peter, an
Pleasure.
interesting conversation to have with you.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
hope
This
that
conversation.
yeah, I hope everyone watching Call Me Data found it relevant, interesting. As Peter always says, send us your feedback, send us your questions, send us
Yes.
your Hawaiian shirts and your photos of Peter in a suit and tie.
Yes, and we will make them live with AI.
Yes. And so, speaking of Hawaiian shirts, will you be back in New Jersey next week, or are you still in sunny
No,
Florida?
one more week in this sunny world of the
Excellent.
South, and then I'm back in New Jersey. But while it's 75
Okay.
degrees here, it's cold there.
No, it's not too bad here. It's not too bad.
You know, when I land, it'll be 15 degrees.
Probably.
Yeah, probably. Anyway, everybody, thank you very much. It was again a great day, but great conversation as always, and I look forward to everybody's feedback. And please join us again next week. We
Yep.
thoroughly enjoy doing this, and again, we'd love your feedback because I'd like to know if we're hitting the mark.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye, Peter.
Take care. Have a great day. Bye now. Bye, Devin.